Okay, so welcome to Security Plus. So we're going to start things off here by starting to identify the fundamentals of computer security. So it's going to be a good idea for us to get the basic terminology down, some of the ideas. That way we can make a foundation for some of our more advanced ideas. So in this section, we're going to identify the fundamental concepts of information security, so that way we can understand security in businesses from the ground up. That way we can begin to construct our building blocks and understand things in the future of this course. So, starting off, information security, identifying security fundamentals. We are going to identify information security concepts. We're going to identify basic security controls, identify basic authentication and authorization concepts, and identify basic cryptography concepts. So we're just going to have a quick overview of the entirety of what we'll see on the Security Plus test, and then we're going to go back and go a little bit deeper into all these concepts. So for the Security Plus test, um, it covers a huge amount of material, and the thing is here, even though we are covering such a wide range of topics, it's about an inch deep, right? So it's a mile wide and an inch deep. And so we just need to be able to know what each one of these concepts are, have a general idea of what some of these more of the advanced topics are, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of cryptography, which encryption and things like that. Now, when we get into encryption, we should be able to know, okay, AES, right? So that stands for Advanced Encryption Standard. And so what we need to be knowing out of AES is that is the main uh, government standard right now, and it's one of the most advanced standards at the moment. So that's all we really need to know about AES. We don't need to know all the major details of AES, but we need to know that. Okay. So starting off, information security. So information security is going to refer to the protection of available information or information resources from authorization access, attack, theft, or data damage. So, responsible individuals and organizations must keep their confidential information secret. Data in all forms must be protected. So, print data, digital media, etc. And therefore, every bit of data that's going to be used, shared, or transmitted must be protected to minimize business risks and any other consequences of losing crucial data. So there are several goals of information security. There are three primary goals involved in the practice of information security. So first off, we have prevention. In this case, um, various types of information are going to need protection. Personal information, company information, information about intellectual property. Um, if there's a breach of security in any of these areas, then the organization is going to have to put forth a lot of effort to recovering any losses. So, establishing prevention measures are going to lessen the effects of any losses from a security breach. Um, Preventing entities from gaining unauthorized access is going to be the number one priority of information security professionals. Next up, we have detection. So, detection occurs when we have discovered attempts to access unauthorized data or information has actually been lost, and we've noticed that it's been lost. So, it can be accomplished by investigating individuals by scanning our network, or or by scanning data and finding any traces left of the intruder, right? And then finally, we have recovery. So if there's a disaster or an intrusion, this can compromise or damage our data. So in this case, we need to employ a process that's going to be able to recover the data from any crash systems or devices. So we can also recover lost or physical resources if we have protections on that as well, right? And that will be done through maybe some sort of RFID or otherwise other asset tracking. Risk. Risk is a concept that indicates exposure to the chance of damage or loss. It signifies the likelihood of a hazard or dangerous threat. So in IT, risk is going to be associated with the loss of a system, power, network, or other physical losses. This can also affect people and processes. So, for example, a disgruntled employee is going to be a threat. And the amount of risk this threat represents depends on the likelihood that this employee is going to access our place of business and then remove or damage data or our site, right? So this is going to depend on the extent as well of the harm that could actually result, right? So organizations must take risk into account when information security is actually designed and implemented. It is much harder to tack security on to an already existing system than it is to build it in from the ground up. So in this case, it says that disgruntled employees, the likelihood of this happening is going to be rare, but the damage will be moderate. And this is going to be like the threat of improper access. The damage, if we had another one saying disgruntled employees, and the likelihood was going to be rare, but the damage would be high, maybe it's them causing physical harm to other employees or something like that, right? One thing I would definitely want to cover here, I want you guys to understand that there is no risk without a threat and a vulnerability. And we're going to get into vulnerabilities and threats a little later on. But risk, in the case of the Security Plus, it is a mathematical computation, basically. So it's going to be threat times a vulnerability is going to give you your risk, basically. Because, hey, if you're in Alaska and you live in the middle of nowhere and you leave your door open or unlocked, you don't have really a risk, right? Because in this case, you got to have a threat, right? So maybe your risk is the door blows open, but you don't have a threat of somebody breaking into your house because you live 100 or 1,000 miles away from anybody. So right, so your vulnerability is the fact that your door is unlocked. But if there's nobody to unlock your door and steal your stuff, then you don't have a risk of being burglarized, right? You don't have. That's just how it works. All right, so let me get into what vulnerabilities are basically. This is any condition that leaves a device open to harm. So going back to that Alaska thing, our vulnerability is we've left our door unlocked, right? So, at its most basic level, a threat is going to be any condition that leaves anything open to harm, right? So we could have in IT, we could have an improperly configured or installed hardware or software. We could have delays in applying and testing software and firmware patches. And so that's what happened with Equifax. They had a firmware patch which they knew about for 6 months before they, that's what let the attackers get in. They knew there was a patch available to Equifax. They never got around to patching it, and they were vulnerable because of that. And they had a threat, which was the hackers. Um, so also we can have untested software firmware patches. So these can actually cause our system to go down because they weren't properly tested. We can have bugs in our software or operation systems. So a bug is going to be things that's going to make problems in our code, which is going to make our software or operating system do things that we didn't anticipate, right? Um, Misusing software communication protocols. Uh, when we talk about misusing protocols, right? Um, think of it this way. Back in the day, all telephones were analog. And so if you remember, when you dial a phone number, it makes different sounds, right? The three sounds a little bit different than a zero. And so those were analog signals that um, the phone company or the technology could pick up. And there were certain people that hacked phones basically by playing different tones to the phone line and maybe giving themselves a free long distance call or something like that, right? So that was misusing the communication protocol, basic in that sense. Um, we could have poorly designed networks, so we could have gaps in our network, right? We could have poor physical security, same deal here. Insecure passwords. That's why all the time you see nowadays where they're saying, okay, make a uppercase and lowercase and um, X amount of crazy characters and numbers, all of that, right? We could have design flaws in our operating system or software, or unchecked user input, right? So maybe somebody types in some code into a username and password form, and they're able to get in by using code which lets them automatically log into the first user in the database or something like that, right? So in this case down here, we have an attacker which uses an unsecured router to get into our information system, and we'll get into what routers are and things of that nature as we move forward in this class. Okay, so threats. A threat is going to be any event or action that can potentially cause damage to an asset. So a threat is going to be in violation of our security requirements, our policies and procedures. And so it doesn't matter whether this threat was intentional or unintentional, it's still considered a threat, right? So potential threats to a IT system would be unintentional or unauthorized access to data. It could be an interruption of services. It could be an interruption of assets. It could be damage to hardware, and it could be damage to our facility. It also could be unauthorized access to our facilities. And so in this case, when I was talking about the whole Alaska thing, we may have a threat that the door blows open and all the elements get inside to our house, and that way we would have risk. But maybe the threat of us getting to get burglarized, and we live in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody else for 1,000 miles away, there is no risk then to getting burglarized because there's no threat of somebody breaking in, right? But there is a threat of bad winter weather blowing open our door, and we get home and there's 2 feet of snow in our house. Attacks. So an attack in IT, once again, this is going to be a technique or a vulnerability in an application or physical computer system without the authorization to do so. So this is it's going to be a technique used to exploit a vulnerability. So we could have physical security attacks where somebody physically breaks in, right? We can have software-based attacks in which somebody attacks whatever operating system or something that we're on. We can have social engineering attacks in which we trick people into giving us what we want. A web-based application attack, so getting at Facebook or something, that's a web application, right? Instagram is a web application. And network-based attacks, so attacking our our network, right? Your Comcast router, your home network, right? Or the MC's network, the Wi-Fi MC. All of those are different types of attacks. Controls. So when it comes to controls, um, these are going to be countermeasures that we need to put into place to avoid, mitigate, counteract counteract security risks due to threats and attacks. So, in other words, these are the solutions and activities that enables an organization to meet the objectives of our security strategy, right? To make sure that we are actually secure. So, controls can be logical or physical, and they're broadly classified into three different realms, right? So we have prevention control. So this is going to be preventing a threat or attack from exposing our vulnerabilities, right? So like locking our doors, a prevention control, right? Um, Detection controls. So these help us to discover whether a vulnerability, a threat or a vulnerability has actually entered our system, right? So this is helping us know, did somebody hack into our system? So example of this would be, we have cameras around a building, right? And we see that somebody's walking around our building at 3 a.m. That's a detection. And then we finally have correction controls. So correction controls, these are going to help us mitigate the consequences from actually hurting us, adversely affecting our computer system. So if we have a guard, right? This guard is going to possibly respond to our alarm, right? If somebody trips our alarm, then the guard is going to go there and he's going to try to stop the intruder. So that is our correction control. And once again, prevention controls are going to help us prevent an attack from exposing a vulnerability. Detection is going to help us to discover if a threat or vulnerability has entered the computer system. And then correction controls are going to help us to mitigate the consequences of a threat or attack from adversely affecting our computer systems. So, the security management process. This is going to involve identifying, implementing, and monitoring computer security controls. Or not just computers, but security controls, right? All right, so first up, we have identification security controls. So this is going to involve detecting problems and determining how best we are going to protect our system, right? Like such as finding out when and where the security breach happened, logging the details of the breach, showing information that tells us that there was a failed attempt at getting in, right? So we'll have an audit log saying somebody put in the wrong username and password 6 times before they got in, right? And that will be logged. We would be able to go through and see that somebody tried this, right? Or maybe this is just having um, application do this for us, right? So maybe we have an intrusion detection system or prevention system, which is going to automate that. Implementing security controls. This is actually installing those, right? Um, so this would be installing a security mechanism such as that IDS or IPS that I was just talking about to prevent any attacks. This could be matching security controls with our policies that we put in place. And it could also be authenticating our users, right? With like username and passwords, or maybe only giving them access to their specific um, domain, such as like maybe their HR, and they can only access HR's files. And finally, we have monitoring. So this is going to be detecting and solving any security issues that arise after our security controls are implemented. So once again, this could be our um, IDS or IPS. It monitors our system, right, and finds out whether there was a problem. We could be running tests on our controls and see if they're actually working, right? We could be um, documenting any failures and seeing what needs to be updated. So, hey, we sit here and we check to see if somebody got in or used different passwords to get in. Use the default password. Well, now we need to update our information and implement something else, right? So, our first activity of the chapter is going to be identifying information security basics. So we are going to be the brand new security administrator for Developtech Industries, and they're a manufacturer of home electronics. Our colleagues wanted to discuss security and how it relates to the business. So this first activity, we're going to have many. Some of these activities are going to be um, hands-on dealing with technical controls, and others are going to be simple quizzes, right? And so this first activity is a quiz, and we're just going to have a couple multiple choice questions and a um, brief essay question. So go ahead and work on that. All right, so in security, we have three main principles, which are called the CIA triad. Um, this includes confidentiality, integrity, and availability. On your test, you're likely going to see it strictly referred to as CIA. This is because the test really pushes acronyms. So if there is a possibility of an acronym being used anywhere in the question, they're most likely going to use it. And we have 200 or 300 acronyms we need to get down as much as possible. I know it's hard. It is. You can't always remember all of them, but we need to try to get them down as much as we can. A way I am able to usually remember acronyms is rather than simply saying CIA, I say exactly what it means: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that way it's kind of cemented in my mind that that's what CIA is. So moving forward, as to what this all means, confidentiality, this is going to be the keeping of information and communications private, protected, and from unauthorized access. So this is going to include military secrets, this is going to include trade secrets, personal records, health records, tax records, etc. And this is going to be typically controlled via encryption, access control, meaning who has access to what, and steganography, which is it's a technique that we're going to get in sooner, but at the moment just think about it like hiding information within a picture. If you ever seen that movie with Tom Hanks, I believe it was called National Treasure, um, but that might be a different movie. But the one where he was messing around in the Vatican, and that was his, as a professor, that's what he was used to doing, was finding like things hidden inside of artworks and things like that. So that's what we're doing here. Um, integrity. So, integrity is going to be the fundamental principle of keeping organizational information accurate, free from errors, and free from unauthorized modification. We don't want people changing our records, right? So, this, for an example, if there was an attack on a school system, this might have included the modification of test scores or other information stored on the network, right? And so maybe they changed grades, and that is an issue. So we control integrity via something called hashing, digital signatures, which involves hashing, and a couple other things on top of that, certificates, which we're going to get into as well, and change control, right? All right. And then finally, we have availability. So this is the principle of ensuring that computer systems operate continuously and that authorized persons can access the data that they need. So, information available on a computer is going to be pretty much useless unless we can actually get to that information, right? So, if the FAA, the people that control the air traffic control, right? If they were unable to get radar images of the skies, planes would be crashing, right? Um, and then this is going to be controlled via redundancy, fault tolerance, and patching. On top of all of these, we have the concept of non-repudiation. And non-repudiation is the goal of ensuring that the person or party or computer that sent the transmission or created data is going to remain associated with that data, and they can't deny actually creating or sending the data, right? There's ways to kind of like spoof it and try to pretend like the data came from somewhere else, but this is a goal here, is to ensure non-repudiation. So we should be able to independently identify the identity of the message sender, and that sender should be held accountable for that message and its data, right? Um, it is a way to determine accountability, right? And so accountability is going to be the process of determining who to hold responsible for any particular event or activity, such as a log on or sending of an email, etc. After that, we have identification. So, identification in security terms is going to be the process by which a claim is made about the nature of a particular entity, right? So, I'm saying that this is me. I'm whatever your email is, right? I'm Big Poppy 36 at gmail.com, right? That is you identifying yourself. And then we have another step after that, which is going to associate our identification with a resource, such as that email address or a username, with a password, which is going to be our authentication. So, authentication is going to be the method of validating a particular entity or individual's unique credentials, right? So, when I give an email name or a username, I am going to authenticate myself, meaning I am who I say I am by giving up a password or something like that, right? So I'm telling you, my name is John and John Jacobs or something like that, right? And so, how do I prove that I'm John Jacobs? I prove myself by um, providing my authentication mechanism, which there are several of. On top of that, and we're going to get into the authentication factors that we can use to authenticate somebody's given identification. But on top of authentication, um, we're going to use that to make sure that an individual has the correct credentials to access our system, right? So that's what the authentication is actually doing, right? So we're proving that we are John Jacobs. And am I the John Jacobs that needs to be able to access the system? Well, the computer is going to check in a database to make sure that the John Jacobs in that computer uses the password that I've given it, right? Or the John Jacobs in the computer has the same fingerprint as I do, right? And so we need to keep these credentials secret, the credentials being whatever authentication factor we're using, maybe a password, right? To prevent any unauthorized people, so people who may be pretending to be John Jacobs or just another different John Jacobs, from accessing our confidential information. So we have several different authentication factors, right? Meaning ways we can say yes, it is true, I'm John Jacobs, right? And this can be something you are. So, something you are is going to be fingerprints, retinal patterns, something, physical characteristics, right? Um, even like face ID. That's something you are, right? Face ID checks the um, mathematical proportions of your face, distance between your eyes, nose, and lips, etc. Right? Something you have, right? So that would be a key. That could be or an ID card, right? So when you go to your door, um, at home, you have a key. You're authenticating your house, basically. But think of it a better, since we're dealing with technology, a better way of doing this is, all right. Some places have little boxes next to the door that you got to tap your card on, right? Your ID from your job, and that will allow you access to that room or whatever the case is, right? So that's something you have. Something you know is a password or a PIN, right? Something you know could also be where some of our security questions, right? Where did you meet your spouse? Where were you born? What was your original address, right? Those are all something we know. And then somewhere you are or are not, right? So somewhere you are or are not could use IP addresses. So IP addresses, we want to make sure somebody's in the building, right? Um, so we have a cybersecurity lab here at MC, and if you are located on campus, you are supposed to use the IP directly to the lab, and I believe the lab is somewhere in Germantown. But if you are not on campus, then you type in this URL, and so the IP address only works if you are actually located on campus. So that would be somewhere we are or are not. And we would use two different ways of access depending on that. It could be GPS location, right? So maybe we only want people logging in from North America, right? Yeah, you can work from home, whatever you want to, right? But the minute it says that you're in Moscow, it's not going to let you on, right? Somewhere you are or are not. And then we could have something we do, such as keystroke patterns, right? So all of us type a little bit different from each other, right? We type with different amount of force. We make different mistakes. We have different speeds at which we type. So in a keystroke pattern, it's going to gather a lot of data. This is not just going to be a one-time typing situation. The computer is going to try to basically do data analysis on how you type, right? And then come up with a baseline of your average typing method. Um, and then we have tracing picture passwords, right? So you Android users that make draw the little pattern to unlock your phone, that's something you do as well. Authorization. So authorization is going to be the process of determining what rights and privileges a particular entity has. So it's equivalent to basically a security guard checking the guest list at a club, right? You tell him I'm on the list, right? And he checks to see if you're there, and then maybe he lets you in. Or maybe, you go to the movies and you got to show them that you have a ticket stub, right? So after a user has been identified and authenticated, the system then determines what rights we're able to access. So here at MC, after we both, you and I, whoever's watching this video, we both have MC accounts, and when I log into MC, I see something different than you. Because when you log in, you see a bunch of student information, maybe your schedule of classes, maybe financial aid information, etc. Me, I see all that as well, but the first thing I see is information pertaining to me being a teacher here, an instructor. So I can see who's on my class list. I can get information about payroll, some other few things that aren't coming to me off the top of my head. But you and I both have different levels of authentication. I mean, authorization in this case, right? And so that shows me what resources we are individually able to access. And we have access control. So access control is the process by determining and assigning privileges to resources, objects, and data. Right. So this was basically the process of um, allowing me to see the things that I see on my MC versus the process of you um, getting able to see what you see, right? Because somebody has to have that access control in place, a checkbox or something that's going to say, hey, I'm allowed to see stuff about who's in my class, and maybe your checkbox is not clicked off there, right? Um, so in this case, we have a user and we have an administrator, and this administrator is, I guess, assigning privileges to each particular user. Maybe they are in finance, and so they get to see the sales data, right? However, somebody in HR, they just get to see information about employees, but they don't get to see the sales data, right? We could also be given access to objects. Everything's an object, basically, if you didn't know that in computers. Um, so in this case, this printer, this is a resource, but it's also an object. And so you may not be able to have access to use this computer, right, in on the third floor, right, because you're a fourth floor person, and we don't want you using up our ink, right? So you have no access to that. And then maybe, like I said before, we have HR and finance. And hey, HR is allowed to access employee data as it pertains to, I don't know, where they live or something like that. But finance is not able to because they don't need to know that. All they need to do is the numbers and make sure that we're meeting our goals as a company. So, accounting and auditing. In security terms, accounting is going to be the process of tracking and recording system activities and resource needs or access, right? This is tracking down what people did, right? So we can account for meaning we can log everything that pretty much goes on the computer, right? You could log keystrokes, you could log your browsing history as a log, right? So that is your accounting for your browser. And then auditing is going to be the portion of accounting that entails security professionals examining logs of what was recorded. So hey, you have a history online, and I know a lot of people they don't want other people to see their history, right? Well, auditing would be somebody going through and checking your history and seeing what you've been doing online, right? Okay. Principle of least privilege. The principle of least privilege establishes that users and software should have the minimal level of access that is necessary for them to perform the duties required of them. All right. So this would be applying to facility access, computer hardware, software, information, etc. So when a user or system is given access to something, that access should only be at the level required for them to perform any necessary tasks that they have. Right. So the principle of least privilege would be, okay, you need let's say the janitor or something, right? The janitor just needs to have access to the cleaning controls. They need access. I mean, not access to cleaning supplies, and they need access to um, rooms in a building, right? So maybe they have access to the cleaning supply closet. They have their own key for that, and then they have a key for pretty much every door in the building, right? Because they need to clean in there. And then you have a person in IT, right? Well, guess what? The person in IT does not have a key for every door in the building. The person in IT will have a key for their part, right? For their room, their part of the building, right? And the person in IT has the password to a computer, right? To a workstation. Well, guess what? The janitor doesn't have the password to that workstation. The janitor has the ability to gain access to the what she needs to do to perform her job, or his or her job. Whereas though the IT professional, he or she, only has access to what they needed to have access to, which is maybe, their workstation area, or maybe the server room, right? And then the janitor's work closet, that's locked to them. They don't need to have access to that. So we are only assigning the level of access needed to perform what we need to do given our position. In this case, down here, we have data entry clerks, right? So the data entry clerk is going to be able to answer data into something, and then maybe they can't change it afterwards. Whereas though maybe these financial coordinators are able to read what they put in, the data entry clerks, and also maybe modify it or send it to somebody else, etc., right? But in either case, but they won't have HR's information. So they are allowed to do what they need to do to get their job done, and the same thing here, right? And the same thing with our IT professional and our sanitary or our custodial professional, right? Trust me, I used to be a janitor myself, so I know how that works. Privilege management. So, privilege management is going to be the use of authentication and authorization mechanisms to provide centralized or decentralized administration of user and group access control. So, this is the ability for the administrator to say who has access to what, right? What user? This could be a specific user. So, Bob, we could say, okay, Bob has access to this, that, and the third. Or we could do it by groups. So, Bob and Tom and Mary, since they're all in HR, they all get the same level of access. And so, privilege management needs to include things such as auditing to track the privilege use and any potential privilege escalation. So then maybe we could see, hey, why was Bob given access to a higher level folder than the rest of the HR team, right? And so we'll check and see when Bob actually was given that privilege, right? Single sign-on. So single sign-on is gonna provide users with a one-time authentication to multiple sites or servers, right? So in this case, or resources. So in this case, the person who wants to, I don't know, access, let's stick with MyMC, right? So you have a single sign-on going there with MyMC. Is when you sign into MyMC, you are able to access email, which is Outlook, off that same sign-on that you used to get into MyMC, right? So that was a single sign-on for you. Next up, our second activity of the chapter. So, identifying basic security controls. You are the security administrator for Developtech Industries, a manufacturer of home electronics. You are going to want to identify information security controls that could be beneficial for Developtech to implement. So in this case, we have a few multiple choice questions, and once you have completed those questions, come back and continue on with the slides. All right, so we went briefly over different information security controls. One of these controls was authentication. So authentication has many different ways to accomplish its goal. And so here we're going to look at some of these because that's our first line of defense in securing a network, right? So there's a bunch of different mechanisms that can even be combined to form more complex authentications, right? So we need to know some of these, especially for the test. But just in general as well. Maybe you recognize some of these. So we should all pretty much be understanding of what a password is at this point, right? It's in everybody's day-to-day life almost. So in this type of authentication, a user's credentials are going to be compared against credentials stored in a database. So this is the user, and they have their username and they have their password. And so if the username and the password match whatever's stored in this database, then the user is authenticated. And if not, then they are going to be denied access. So it's not that there's no guarantee that the correct user is the one actually putting in the credentials, right? It could be your brother, it could be your significant other, it could be somebody that's hacked you, right? So it's not necessarily the most secure way of authenticating somebody. There's another thing to keep in mind is that when credentials are not encrypted, they are susceptible to an attacker. And we're going to see a bit how they're able to do that, because they are transmitted in a way that anybody could see it if they had the means. Tokens. So a token is a physical or virtual object that stores authentication information. Examples would be smart cards, ID badges, even data packets. But I guarantee you, pretty much all of you are walking around with a token right now, because your credit card with the chip is a token. And so when you stick your token in the little machine, when you your credit card in a POS, so a point of sale terminal, a unique value is then generated by the hardware device or some software, and that gets sent to your bank or whoever, right? However, there's a challenge authentication there, and usually that's going to be like your little PIN, right? And so that's going to send your information to a server, a database, and we're going to end up checking that to see that the PIN and the user information matched, and then they'll send back something to the point of sale terminal. So in this case, the people at whatever store you're shopping at, CVS or whatever, they don't actually get your information, because I'm sure we're all aware of that little black bar on the back of your credit card. Those are very insecure. Those are not secure at all. So people tend to steal the information off those black bars, because that holds all the credit card information. And that can be, I mean, there's people that steal the information off of them and go print them on an Applebee's gift card or something like that, because all it needs to do is just go on one of those black stripes. However, that's why we all have this, the chip now, is because to store a token. But at the same time, I mean, the token, after you've tried putting in a password on using those token things 3 times in a row, you're able to do the swipe anyway. So, hey, it's still not the best type of control there. So in a smart card, which is basically what we're using, but let's say a smart card for a but for a federal organization, maybe a Department of Defense, they use a CAC card. So a CAC card is called a Common Access Card. So that is used to identify any military contract personnel. It's used for maybe the National Guard. It's used for anybody that's involved with DOD, which is Department of Defense. And so the CAC card is normally put into a card reader, which is normally on your keyboard in a government organization, and then it makes sure you are who you say you are and blah, right? So that is a physical way of doing this. And then there's also something called a PIV card. So that's a personal identification verification card. But just be aware of those. Biometrics. So biometrics are the authentication schemes based on the identification of an individual by their physical characteristics. Um, so this can involve fingerprint scanners, retinal scanners, hand scanners, voice recognition software, facial recognition software. Um, you have it on your iPhone probably with the fingerprint scanner. Um, Voice recognition, right? The pitches, the tones of your voice, facial. That's going to be our Face ID and stuff. We've all seen a lot of these already, but those are biometrics. So that is something you are. Geolocation. This is the process of identifying the geographic location of an object, right? So geolocation is going to provide us an extra level of authentication because users who try to authenticate from an approved location can be given access, but those who are not trying to authenticate from approved location, it will be denied, right? So we can perform geolocation with IP addresses. We could do it with Wi-Fi positioning. We can do it with GPS coordinates. And so basically, it's gonna work by looking up a host IP address in their geolocation database, right, to see what country, region, city, whatever we're in. Um, and so that way, when the physical location is determined, it can be compared to a list of approved locations, right? And then we can be given access or restricted from accordingly, right? So if a network attack were to originate in a particular country, the we could see that packets originating from that IP address, we can make them automatically drop or something like that, right? To intercept that traffic. Um, or we could do something like automatically deny requests that are coming out of whatever country that aren't coming from our country, right? So that would limit our risks. Keystroke authentication. Um, so when it comes to keystroke authentication, this is going to be an authentication type that's going to rely on detailed information describing exactly when a key is pressed and released as someone types information into a computer or other electronic device. Um, each user is going to have their own certain tendencies, rhythms, patterns on a keyboard, and these are going to be recorded and measured against any future keystrokes, and it's going to just continue to get better and better as the more keystrokes it actually records by you. So it's going to require the use of a keystroke logger for one, um, and then that way we can record when the key is pressed and released, and the intervals, and when the next key is pressed, so far and so forth and so on. And then the algorithm can establish arc pattern, right? Next up, multi-factor authentication scheme. So this is an authentication scheme that requires validation of two or more distinct authentication passwords. I need you guys to remember that multi-factor has two or more distinct authentication factors. So your username and password, followed by entering in, your best friend on the security question, or your favorite food or favorite movie, book, whatever. That is not multi-factor authentication. That is two-factor authentication. And so multi-factor, you're going to have to use different types such as a token and a password, or a geolocation and a biometric, right? It has to be two different kinds of things. It can't be a retinal scan plus a fingerprint. That is not multi-factor. That is two-factor. Multi-factor has two different types of authentication, right? So, for example, a bank card, right? This is a token, like I was telling you guys, right? Um, it's gonna you're gonna put in a token and a password, right? And that would be an example of multi-factor, right? Because these are two different things. The card itself with the chip is the token, and then you have a pin on top of that. Um, if you don't have to enter a pin, it's not necessarily, well, it isn't multi-factor. Um, so usually, like if you press credit, that's not going to be multi-factor. But if you did debit and added the pin, your pin to it, that would be multi-factor. Um, and then another example would be like getting a validation code from a text message after you log into an email. Um, that would be one because it would be something right? You know your username and password, and then getting that validation code is going to be something you have, right? Because you have your phone on you, which tells you that validation code, right? Um, so we have to make sure that the factors are different, right? In order for it to be really multi-factor authentication. All right. Mutual authentication. This is going to be a security mechanism that requires that each party in a communication verifies the identity of every other party in the communication, right? So we can have a service or a resource that's going to verify the client's credentials, and then the client is going to verify the resource's credentials, right? So mutual authentication in this case is going to prevent a client from submitting confidential information to a non-secure server, and it's going to help us avoid any man-in-the-middle attacks, meaning making sure nobody's sitting in the middle listening to our conversation. So we'll see this a lot. This is how we confirm our identification to each other, like us and the computer. That will be done with something called, well, at least on the server side, will be done with them sending us as the client their certificate, right? And we'll get into what a certificate is, but that's going to help to authenticate that server to us. All right. So our next activity: identifying basic authentication and authorization concepts. Once again, we are a security administrator for Developtech Industries, who makes home electronics, and we're going to want to discuss authentication and authorization methods with our colleagues. So, once again, we have a few multiple choice questions, followed by a quick essay response, or short essay, short form response, whatever. You don't need to write much, just a couple sentences. And then, next slide. Cryptography. So, cryptography is the science of hiding information by encoding and decoding a secret code used to send a message, right? So, it's going to be it's like the backbone of our computer security right now, right? And there are many different cryptographic systems, and each one of these are going to be a bit different, right? However, they all have something in common. They all encrypt, right? So, in this topic, we're going to try to evaluate and understand a little bit of this. So, cryptography itself, it is has its roots in mathematics, computer science, etc. Um, and modern communications, then computing, have to use cryptography extensively in order to protect our information, right? Because we're sending money, we're buying things online, we have all sorts of accounts, and we want to make sure that that stuff is protected, right? And so we want to make sure that nobody also is able to get it as we transmit this information through the wire, right? Um, so cryptography um, is used in this manner here, right? We're going to have this message, right? And in this case, we have a single key, and this key, which is going to be known as a shared key or a symmetrical key, it does encoding, but it also does decoding in this case, right? So this would give this greetings, Mr. Logo WPS, encoded with this key will provide this, and then using the same key, it can decode it and provide us with the plain text. All right, and so we have plain text, which it creates this encryption right here, which is the key, and then we have ciphertext, which comes out, right? So plain text is something that we want to encrypt, right? However, ciphertext is stuff that is encrypted, and then we have clear text, which is another one, which is data that is not meant to be encrypted at all, right? So plain text is going to be unencrypted data that is meant to be encrypted. And then encryption is the cryptographic technique that is going to convert our plain text into our ciphertext, which is the coded text, right? And then decryption is going to be the technique that converts it from ciphertext back into plain text again, right? And then we have clear text, which was text that is never meant to be encrypted at all, right? So when a message is encrypted, only the authorized parties that have a key are going to be able to decode and read the data. And so encryption can be one-way encryption, and one-way encryption, hashing basically, is encryption that is designed to never actually be decrypted. We use that for integrity. So from now on, I'm mostly going to refer to that as hashing. And then we have two-way encryption, which is the encryption that can be encrypted and decrypted, right? It could be turned back into plain text. So our encryption and security goals. Encryption is used for confidentiality by protecting our data from unauthorized access. It is used for integrity because it's hard for people to decipher encrypted data if they don't have the supporting key, right? The decrypting cipher. It's going to help support non-repudiation because only the parties that know about the confidential encryption are going to be able to encrypt and decrypt data, right? So you have to have the key in order to know it. So that means you have to have sent it or been involved, otherwise been involved in this. It supports authentication because you can't, once again, decrypt it unless you have the key. So that kind of authenticates you as being somebody that's supposed to have this information. Not always, but yeah, it supports authentication. And then it can be used as access control. Why? Because only you are supposed to have the key, or whoever the data is meant to be for. All right. So there are different ways we can encrypt things. We can do whole disk encryption. We could do application-based encryption. We can do a bunch of different things. Just message encryption, but we'll get forward into those a little bit later. Ciphers. So a cipher is an algorithm that is going to be used to encrypt or decrypt data. So they can be substitutions, right? So A becomes M, N becomes Z, right? So that is part of a RAT13 cipher. But generally, when we're talking about encryption, we're talking about complex mathematical functions. And the stronger the more complicated that math is, the harder it is to actually break the encryption. So, enciphering is the process of translating our plain text. Remember, that's text that we mean to turn into ciphertext, right? That's stuff that we want to be encrypted. So it turns plain text into ciphertext. And then we have enciphering, which is the process of doing that. And then we have deciphering, which is the process of translating that ciphertext to plain text. Ciphertexts are going to alter individual letters or bits in order to scramble a message up, right? It's kind of like a secret language, right? And then the science of breaking these codes down and ciphers is called cryptanalysis. I believe cryptography itself, the word cryptography, crypt is meaning hidden, and graphy, so like graph meaning picture or writing or something of that nature, if I remember correctly. So it's basically going to mean hidden writing. So cryptography would be, or cryptanalysis would be, breaking that down. A key itself. So a key is a specific piece of information that is used in conjunction with an algorithm to perform encryption and decryption. So different keys are going to produce different ciphertexts. They're going to they can be used with the same algorithm, but they're going to produce different ciphertext, different output, right? So without the correct key, a receiver cannot decrypt the ciphertext even if they know the algorithm, right? So for any given encryption algorithm, the longer the key is, the stronger the encryption is going to be, right? And then we have something called static key and ephemeral keys. Static meaning the key never changes, ephemeral meaning it changes. It goes away, get a new one, right? So think of a key as in think of algebra, right? And we have x, the x value, right? And so a key is going to be whatever x is going to represent in that algorithm, in that question, right? So we might have like something like y x times 35 times 40, whatever, right? And so whatever is in x gives us a different output, right? So if we put 1 in the place of x, the output is going to be different as if we had to put 9 or 99, right? So x in this case would be the key, right? And the rest of the equation is the algorithm, right? And so for any different key that we use with that algorithm, we get a different answer, meaning we get a different output of our ciphertext, right? So no two keys hopefully are going to give us the same output, but using different keys gives us different outputs. So in this case, they have an example where we have our original information, and then we have a cipher, which is, that algorithm, that mathematical equation, right? And then we have the key, right? Let's say so to keep up with my algebra example, so this is our equation, right? This is x, this is our equation, right? And then we're going to have x, which is going to be the key, right? And then we're going to, whatever x is 10 or whatever, right? And that's going to give us our encryption information, right? So the original information plus the cipher, the equation, the algorithm is going to, and a key is going to give us a different output, right? An encrypted information, right? Somebody else's key would give us a different output on that encrypted information as well. So in this case, um, they're talking about 2 letters following. So let's say I had A. Um, this algorithm would say, okay, A is going to be replaced with 2 letters following it, right? So instead of A, my encryption output would be BC. So A is equal to BC in this case, right? And then maybe if somebody was using a different key that said 3 letters following, right? It would be A is equal to BCD. And so when you're trying to spell atom or something, right? You're going to have BCD followed by D for AD. So BCD plus FGE, right? AD. And then back to BCD for the ADA, and then M. So NOP at the end, right? For atom. Sorry if that got you off a little bit, but that's kind of how it's going to work there. All right, so symmetric encryption. So symmetric encryption is a two-way encryption scheme in which encryption and decryption are both performed by the same key, right? So this key, it could be configured in software or it could be coded in the hardware. However, this key must be securely transmitted before communications begin, right? And that can be a little bit difficult to do that. And it is fast. However, it's vulnerable if the key is lost or compromised because, hey, this key does encrypting and it does decrypting, right? So if you lose it, somebody can read your messages and then also send messages as you basically. So common names for symmetric encryption are secret key, shared key, and private key. So in this case, the same key will encrypt our message and decrypt our message, right? To asymmetric encryption. So unlike symmetric encryption, um, asymmetric encryption uses 2 keys. They use a paired public and private key. All right. Um, a private key is going to be a component of asymmetric encryption that is kept secret by one party, right? So in this case, I keep that hidden to me. Nobody gets my private key but me, right? But a public key is accessed by anyone, right? It's another piece, right? That's part of my key pair. So everybody gets my public key. I keep my private key. If you want to send me a message, you take my public key and you are going to send that. You're going to take your message. You're going to encrypt your message with my public key, and you're going to send it to me. And then when I get that message, I take my private key to unlock it. Right. So a public key is going to lock up the message for me that you want to send to me, and then I'm the only one that can unlock it with my private key. I'm the only one who can decrypt it with my private key. Nobody else. So nobody can take my public key and unlock it. It's not going to work. And nobody can use their private key to unlock my public key message that you have meant for me, right? So that is how we are going to get public key and private key asymmetric encryption down. Key generation is the process of producing a public and private key pair because these keys are mathematically linked, and you can use a key generation in Windows. It's something called PuTTY, which will generate keys for you. In Mac and Linux, you can generate keys within the terminal. One other thing about public key and private key encryption. Um, it's it's kind of, it is slower than symmetric encryption, so be aware of that for your test. Hashing. So hashing is a process or function that transforms plain text into ciphertext that cannot be directly decrypted. So, um, we have something called a hash value, or a message digest. All that is the resulting value from hashing a message or data, whatever you want to say, right? So hashing is going to be used in a bunch of different authentication schemes, and um, a hash value can be embedded in in an electronic message in order to create digital signatures, and it's also used for integrity of a file, right? So basically, what happens here, we have a message, and this message contains the word secret, right? And then we run that through a hashing function. This hashing function puts out a message digest, otherwise known as a hash or a hash value. You might have seen this yourself. You might have seen it referred to as a checksum, but they all do the same thing. So this is one-way encryption. Um, so you can never, even this word says secret, right? But you can hash any file, right? And you're going to get an output. Now, this output is always going to be the same length depending on what type of hashing algorithm you're using, but it's basically meant to verify integrity of something, right? Um, as you can see here, this message, keep this secret, and then they run it through a hashing function. As you can see, it's just as long as this message here, right? So if I had to actually put an entire book through a hashing function, beneath here, I would get a message digest that's the same length of these two messages up here, right? So my entire book is going to give me just as long of a message digest as the word secret, or as the word keep this secret. And if you notice, um, even though these both have the same word in them, secret and secret, none of these values are the same between the two of these. That's because in hashing we want things to be we want them disassociated with each other, so that way people can't really try to figure out the original message, right? That is built-in function of it. Steganography. Steganography. This is a technique that's gonna hide a secret message by closing it in an ordinary message, right? Um, so this other message could be, your message could be hidden in a movie, a sound file, a picture. It hides the content information, but doesn't really hide. It hides it in plain sight, basically. Um, so you could actually hide maybe malicious software in this picture, a bunch of different things. And the way people, or you could hide information in here from your, like, people might be sending out emails of government secrets, right? And maybe they would hide this in a picture, right? You could put a whole PDF in here. So maybe some specific proprietary information from Apple or something, and somebody's trying to send it to China so that a company over there can make a copy, right? So maybe they send this out via steganography, hiding it in a picture of their wife and kids or something like that, right? There are ways to find out if somebody was trying to hide information using this method. We'll probably get to that when we get into steganography a little deeper. So, our final activity of the chapter is going to be identifying basic cryptography concepts. Um, You are the administrator for Developtech Industries, a manufacturer of home electronics. You need to prepare for implementing cryptographic technologies. Um, we are going to examine hashing functionality and identifying basic cryptography concepts. So for this activity, what we're going to do is use a hasher, right, to try to demonstrate to you the concept of hashing and how it's really working behind the scenes. So we'll input a couple different words into the hashing function, into the hasher, and we'll look at the hash results and see how they change depending on what we put in there. And that should help to solidify your understanding of what hashing really means and how it can help us to perform integrity, right?